Echoes of history are reverberating loudly and actively resonating in ways that demand attention and contemplation. These echoes are capturing the collective desires, the struggles, and the demands of the population for independence.
A very warm welcome to Resilience of the Spice Isle. I'm Sherwood McCaskey. As always, I'm pleased that you have joined us. In the small villages and bustling towns of Grenada, a sense of collective expectation hung in the air like a delicate mist, both palpable and intangible. The Grenadian people, their spirits charged with the promise of autonomy, were on the precipice of a historic moment. There was a buzz of excitement interwoven with whispers of conversations held in marketplaces and under the shade of the towering trees and along the pristine beaches that framed this island. As Grenada awaited independence from British colonial rule, there was a mixture of anticipation, hope, and anxiety among its people.
When we're considering the Grenada Revolution, we've got to look at it a very wide perspective in relation also to the other islands that are now the OECS. They were not at the time. They were all considered to be associated states to Britain. Because you see, with the fall of the Federation, Britain really didn't know what to do with the islands of the Lesser Antilles. They more or less realized, okay, Barbados has become independent, Trinidad, Jamaica, Guyana, they're gone. But what are we going to do with the islands of the Lesser Antilles, the Windwards and the Leewards? And so they devised this system of associated statehood. They would have self-government. They would be totally responsible for their own affairs, except for defense and foreign affairs. And then the governor would be a local national, and they would still communicate with the Foreign Office, that is the governors, and be a representative of the Queen in the islands. So that was up to 1967, and then Grenada was the first in 1974 to become independent, to take its independence. And this was under great pressure because the New Jewel movement had been founded by then, and there was great pressures on the government of Eric Gairy and the peculiarities, of course, of his rule. But what we must understand with these islands, and I'm including St. Lucia, Dominica, St. Vincent and the rest, was that they got their universal adult suffrage in 1951. In 1951, when universal suffrage, adults over the age of 21 were permitted to vote with none of these qualifications, you had on all the islands a surge of working class leaders. And in the case of Grenada, you had Eric Gairy, and most of them were linked to the trade union movement. So for instance, you had Byrd in Antigua, V.C. Byrd, also politicizing on the base of union membership. You had in St. Lucia and in St. Vincent, you had Joshua and others. So all of them were of that working class background, and a book has been written about it, The Ruler in Heruna, written by a former senior civil servant in St. Vincent who also served in Grenada. And it really is a reflection on Gairy or Joshua's government. And that is very important because, you see, it stunned the elite. The elite, basically their power was undermined. They maintained the land holding and they maintained the commercial sector, but basically the people who flooded into positions of political power were the working class. And, you know, you read it in V.S. Naipaul's work as well, where they're taking the mickey out of these people fresh from the villages and the fields, and they're being put into these new positions, and the mistakes that they make and all of that. So fine, you have that. You become an associated state, you are the premier, and you are in charge of all of the internal affairs. There's no longer the British administrator who communicates with London every day about the things that are going on. So everything is put into the hands of the premier, as he was called then. Now, what the British did was, and this has colored the whole nature of Caribbean politics in the Eastern Caribbean, is that all the powers that the administrator had were basically handed to the chief minister, who after 1967 became the premier. So here you have these chief ministers dotted up and down the islands with this overriding power, and a local governor who basically had to rubber stamp whatever it is they said. And so the situation remained until the early 70s, when Gary, in his manner, he was always sort of, you know, the first on deck, he decided to bring Grenada into independence in 1974.
So far as we are concerned, we're going to have a very colorful, a very successful, a very meaningful, and a very spectacular celebration starting less than 2 weeks from now.
Well, I think independence is one of the best things for a developing country like Grenada. Since 1967 that we have, since we attained internal self-government, we have already been independent. The trouble is this right now is just a matter of handing the paper into us. What we believe in is our bread and butter, our produce. I'm a producer. And since this talk about independence, we realize that so many people have been trying to stall the whole show.
Many times, a dog might be lying on the ground, and people attempted to make the mistake to think the dog is dead. The dog is resting. We did everything possible that one can do in order to reach settlement with the opposition. But the smallest child can see today that the opposition splinters, whether they be GNP, Joel, or whether they be members of the Committee of 22, they have one thing in mind, that is to try to prevent a successful independence celebration. In cricket, we all know you cannot get a man out by catching the ball behind the boundary.
Gary became a strong nationalist, one would say, in the same vein as you would see other Caribbean leaders. He wanted independence for Grenada. That was one of his big push throughout the 60s. Actually, when we got associated statehood, he wasn't in power at the time. He basically said, why are we even wasting our time with this? We should go to independence. So he was a real advocate, and he's considered the father of Grenada's independence.
In the light of the several demonstrations over the past few days, would you say, how would you assess, Mr. Gary, the emotional readiness of the people of Grenada for independence?
I am quite accustomed to this sort of behavior. The opposition have always opposed anything that is good for Grenada. They were opposed to the exposition that was held here in '69. They were opposed to Grenada's participation in the Miss World contest, 70-71, and they are opposed and would be opposed to anything that is good for Grenada. As a matter of fact, what we are seeing in Grenada today is nothing different to what we saw, say, 3 years ago, when we had some confrontation with nurses and school children, and they were in the same number. Some of the people who demonstrate are really my people. They get a kick out of it. They like it. After all the demonstrations they were having 3 years ago, we won elections in the next few months. Afterwards, 13 out of 15 seats. So some of the people you've seen there today are really our supporters, but they get a kick from going ahead, and we're not stopping them.
Although we noticed that they were talking about police brutality and things like this. I mean, how do you plan to deal with all these charges continually?
Well, I don't think that they're very much justified. The statements, the claims are not justified. I don't think they can prove them, because they themselves were demonstrating today are breaking the laws. They have been infringing all sorts of laws. They're asking people to close their shops and their stores, and they themselves, the Seamen and Waterfront Workers Union, are the people who've been asking us to include in our Constitution a clause to give support to the right to work. And they themselves have come back into breaking this part of the Constitution. I see this thing as prenatal pains. You know, before a child is given, is come to birth, the mother must have pains, and Grenada is being born into a new nation.
Well, even before independence, you had a whole group of Grenadians that opposed. You had a party which was the GNP, which was a somewhat middle-class party, and they had serious opposition to his movement of Grenada's achievement as it relates to independence.
One of the reasons why they're opposed to the government is that we are too progressive. We're working faster, perhaps, than they can adjust their minds to appreciate. We work with speed. We do things like big nations.
What have you done? What have you done that you haven't, that they haven't recognized?
Well, we worked right on, as you would see, to independence. This in itself is a big attainment, big achievement. And you know, this is the first of the Windward and Leeward Island groups that is doing this.
What is your reaction, Mr. Gary, to the apparent desire by Carriacou to secede?
It doesn't bother me. It is good to have the people of Carriacou linked on to Grenada. It is a financial burden to start with, but we enjoy the friendship and the relationship that seem to go on. But if they, that is the majority of people, elected to secede, I'm not going to cry over this. My government is not going to cry over this at all.
In other words, you don't see it as a problem.
No, we have nothing to lose. But the people who support the idea of independence, and I think they're in the majority, we'd have to take their views into consideration.
In 1974, when we did get independence, it was under a state of emergency. The island was basically shut down. The ports were closed, schools were closed. There was rioting in the streets, there was looting.
That was very instructive, because there were strikes, there were demonstrations, the nurses, the teachers. It was a whole societal uprising. Even as the working class remained very committed to Eric Gary, the children of those that he defended, the children rose up and said we wanted more. We wanted not just a society, but a just society. And there were tensions, intergenerational tensions in Grenada. And that created a very conflictual political environment.
Independence, after all, can only be meaningful if it means more than pulling down a flag and devising a new anthem and creating a new song. Independence must mean more than independence celebrations and flowers. After all, you can't eat flowers. We are saying that for a country to be independent in its really meaningful sense, i.e. politically, socially, economically, morally even, it must be a particular process, a particular procedure which must be followed. And if that procedure is followed, then Grenada can, in fact, be a vibrant little independent country. Now, of course, it will not be independent, particularly in an economic sense. But then virtually no country in the world today is. But independence can only become important to us if we are involved in it at every stage leading up to the independent state.
And a very interesting point as well is that they wanted independence with reparations. So this idea of reparations was coming since then. As far as they were concerned, yes, you're giving us independence, but you have extracted quite a lot. What are you giving us along with that paper independence then? Where is the finances to go with it to build our infrastructure, schools, hospitals, and all of those things? So that reparations question started for Grenada since the 1970, going into 1974 into 1975, when we were asking for independence.
There was a lot of opposition to Grenada becoming independent because they felt that under Gary, especially because of some of the friends that he was cultivating at the time, he was seen as dictatorial. I think the branding of him as comparison to Haiti, I think, was definitely not on par. I think that was under the belt. Comparing his Mongoose gang to the Tonton Moncoute was a little over the top. But nonetheless, Gary definitely flouted the Constitution, and he felt pushed to the wall, and he reacted by the friendships that he would entertain with Chilean dictator and things like that, and had Grenadians trained, military people trained in these countries. So he definitely was cultivating friends that were questionable. I think he felt under siege by the propaganda and the radical nature of the opposition, I think. One would consider the opposition was really pushing the boundaries in how they interacted with Gary.
Well, so far as the removal of the government is concerned, it is our firm conviction that the people are presently engaged along the right lines. We believe that once the struggle remains in the streets, once we continue to involve ourselves in people's politics, that the government must go. It could only be a matter of time. In our view, it cannot be longer than a week or two. It will certainly come before independence.
Well, this is stretching one's imagination too far. I mean, we're not marginal. We have won elections 13 out of 15, and one of those that we lost by one vote only. And since then, the holder of that seat is absconded. I mean, we're not just a marginal government. We are well entrenched. And if we thought of leaving the people, resigning from government, we would be the biggest traitors on earth. We can't afford to exercise that degree of treachery against the good people who voted for us and are still with us. Entrenched we are, and we're going to stay there and be removed by the X 3 years from now. But we hope to be there for the next 15 years.
How equipped is the new dual movement to form a government?
Well, we are ready and prepared to form a government tomorrow morning. Our fundamental position is that a government must not be made up of personalities, but can only be made up of people who are based in organizations. Therefore, a government in which the new dual movement is involved would be a government comprising workers and people around the country who are involved at some level or the other in organizational activity.
What role would you envisage then for the Grenada National Party in a framework of this sort?
Well, there is a fundamental point of departure so far as the political situation is concerned between the GNP and ourselves. They remain firmly entrenched in electoral politics. We have been saying that electoral politics is not democratic. It represents only 5 seconds of democracy in 5 years. And we have been proposing a new governmental form, what we call assemblies of the people. Its nearest form would be the Tanzanian model. Roughly speaking, what that involves is that there will be village assemblies around the country and workers' assemblies. And these bodies would select representatives to go up to a national assembly, and that would be the government of the country. In that sense, therefore, the new dual movement as an organization would not be running the country, but the people organized at a local level and workers organized at their places of work. This was how we see the governmental situation.
By the way, when Grenada becomes independent in 1974, Maurice Bishop is held incommunicado in the prisons.
Eric Geary explains why Maurice Bishop is arrested and detained in prison.
I feel that they don't have the intelligence here to present the plan which I saw with my own eyes. And I gave the police, I asked them, as a matter of fact, to allow you, the pressmen at radio, television, to see some.
Can you say which nightclub this was?
My nightclub, the plans that I saw are plans of my own premises. And it is true that I go there every Saturday evening. It is true that I go there with a mace because on the back of the plan, they said that I travel there with a mace. I go there every Saturday night. I drink champagne, I drink wines. And their plan was that when I go to the men's, that team number, I can't remember what number, team number so would come and what they would do, and then team number. This thing has been too expertly planned to be done by those, I call them numbskulls that they have here as lawyers.
Lloyd Noel of the New Dual Movement denies Geary's claims.
We've never said at any time that our motive or our ideas was one of force to overthrow the government. Obviously, we look at Maurice as one of our 2 leaders, and therefore in his absence, we're naturally going to have to keep cool until we've got him. Then we can regroup and rethink.
Meanwhile, on the streets of Grenada, Angela Bishop, the wife of Maurice Bishop, is making her position known to the masses via the media.
There was definitely no rifle found in the house. Definitely no rifle found in the house.
Is a rifle mentioned in the charges that have now been filed?
Well, they have charged him in being in possession of arms and ammunition. So
Did they specify which arms?
No, they didn't specify. Well, it seems as though, lots of charges in the past have been created, so I wouldn't be surprised at all if this one were.
How do you view his arrest?
I expected it.
Why?
Because he has what lots of people don't have, which is a brain.
How do you mean that?
Well, the gentleman who is in charge of the country is against anyone who has a brain and anyone who can think and reason like a human, which is what my husband can do.
We've applied for bail. One of my legal friends have gone off to get a magistrate, and to date, whether the offence is a summary or indictable one, the magistrate might name his fee for a bail, and if that is agreed, we can have him out today.
We can go further to tell you that magistrate was contacted this morning, Ernest John, as far as we're told, and he said that he's washed his hands. He's not getting involved.
Of course, Gary gets independence for Grenada. On the 7th of February, the British flag is going down and the Grenada flag is going up. There are no lights because people are still on strike. So it's in darkness with what we call Masantos at the time, lighting what's happening.
You see some of the old photographs and there are people with lights, when the Union Jack comes down and Grenada's flag go up.
Created the heaven and the earth, and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters, and God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Immeasurable damage has been done to our dear land and people by the enemies of progress. Peaceful, loyal citizens and residents have been made to face great inconveniences. The enemies of progress have done more damage to Grenada than Hurricane Janet. The tourist industry has been virtually crippled. Hotel owners, hotel workers, taxi drivers, vendors, farmers, nutmeg producers have all suffered considerably. Trade unions have called illegal strikes. Businessmen and women have defied the laws of the land. Several other people have committed breaches of the law. However, now should not be a time for recriminations and reprisals, but rather, now is the time for goodwill. Now is the time for unity. Now is the time for reconstruction. And so, I now appeal to all Grenada in its totality to join heads, hearts, and hands in unity to repair the damage done and to build a Grenada for ourselves and for posterity. I invite all opposition factions to let me hear from them as soon as possible regarding the reaction to my appeal. God bless you all as a new nation is born.
Reaction is that it is a most unpopular Independence Day. Is that how you obviously you wouldn't describe it that way, but I mean, how popular is it among the massive people here?
I would say 95%.
And what happens to the other 5%?
Oh, well, there are people who are always willing and ready to disrupt any institution. If it were another government, they'd do the same thing.
And that is how we got our independence on February 7th.
There are a series of events which continue to, I want to say, make Gary look bad. Gary was doing a lot of it by himself anyway.
And then he gets into problems with the critique, the neo-colonial critique that is developing throughout the Caribbean after the other countries had become independent, because Grenada becomes independent then after Barbados and Guyana and Trinidad and Jamaica. So by the time you're getting there, there's already anti-neo-colonial critique developing in some of those other countries, and it is in place in Grenada, especially in the context of a kind of radicalism that was developing across the Caribbean, in which there was a mixture coming out of the 1960s civil rights movement in the United States, which matured into Black Power, where Black Power was starting to merge with Marxism in the Caribbean context. So a lot of the people that became Marxists, Caribbean Marxists in the 70s were people that had been influenced by Black Power in the 60s, whether midway in the 60s or late. But the similar thing was happening in Grenada now in relation to the people who were starting to critique Gary. So Gary had been a popular labor movement leader, and he was the natural leader to carry Grenada into independence. But he was increasingly subject to the critique that a lot of these leaders were under by the time that was happening. And his thing became more extreme. So that's where I would say that Grenada at the time of independence was moving in that direction. And then it is in the 70s that you get the emergence of the New Jewel movement, which is a mixture of two left-wing movements, progressive movements. They were more on the line of the kind of black nationalists. But there were people in that leadership, including Morris Bishop, and then eventually Bernard Coard, who were Marxists. Okay? And I will address that, because some people like to draw a line between Coard and Morris Bishop. The people who were trained in Marxism and understood Marxism and so on, and knew both of them, couldn't see any difference between the two of them. So that was a good political tool to use against the revolution in terms of dividing it and so on. So make us stop there and then come back into the points if you wish.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. Grenada's journey to independence reflects a combination of political activism and historical events that shaped the nation's path towards self-governance. It was not just a political milestone, it was a culmination of a shared journey, a testament to the resilience and unity of a people bound by the love for their homeland. I'm Sherwood McCaskey.